Happy New Year, everybody, and welcome to my lists of the best and worst movies of 2022. I skipped out on doing one of these for 2021 films because honestly, I didn't see lots that year, certainly not enough to make a best and worst of list. In 2022, I seen 45 films, which is still a lot less than I watched in, for example, 2017, 18, or 19, where I seen close to or more than 100 films in each of those years. One of the reasons that I didn't watch as many films as I had over the past few years is because I was a lot more selective with what I watched. From 2017 to 2019, my wife and I would essentially just watch whatever came out in those years, and as a result, my best and worst of lists were a lot more comprehensive. But for 2022, we tried to stick to things that we thought were going to be good, something we'd been excited about, something we'd been anticipating. As a result, we didn't watch as many bad films as we had over previous years. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to do my top 10 best films of the year, but for my worst of, I'm just going to do my bottom 5. So let's get started with my bottom 5 movies of the year, and kicking things off at number 5, Shut In. Shut In flew under most people's radars when it was released, but I heard about it when it started attracting a surprising amount of acclaim from both critics and audiences, who seemed to completely change their mind on it as the year went on. It's one of those person stuck in a seemingly inescapable situation storylines like Gerald's Game or 127 Hours. In this case, it's a woman who's trapped in the pantry of her house by her ex-boyfriend. It's got some really good performances, especially from Vincent Gallo, a man Liam and I discussed at length when we talked about Buffalo 66 on our podcast. I'll leave a link below. And this is his first acting role in almost 10 years, so it was definitely surprising to see him back and acting his ass off. For me, the film's main flaw was that Jessica, the character who's trapped, either seems unconcerned about escaping or completely ignores the most obvious way of getting out. The longer the film went on, the more frustrating it got, and even though it's only 89 minutes long, her utter lack of urgency really spoiled what could have easily been a very compelling thriller. But in the end, I was just disappointed. Next up at number 4, it's Pinocchio. The Disney live-action remake train rolls on with Pinocchio, and at this point I really don't know what I'm hoping to get out of them, or what to say about them that many others haven't said already. Robert Zemeckis continues his obsession with CGI animation that's more frightening than charming, and Tom Hanks, arguably the world's most likeable actor, can't do much to save a film that's essentially dead on arrival. Following most of the same plot beats but with a few extra songs and additional wackier shenanigans with the worst rendition of Jiminy Cricket I've ever seen, it takes a classic morality tale, strips away the life lessons and replaces it with flashy imagery and meaningless musical numbers. Even the chase with Monstro, an iconically scary sequence from the original, is listless and uninteresting here. Disney has certainly churned out worse remakes in recent years, but that's still not a recommendation by any means. At number 3, we have Halloween Ends. The first horror movie in my bottom 5, but certainly not the last. Halloween Ends is the 13th movie of the series, but the timeline is so all over the place with sequels, reboots, and spin-off that trying to make sense of it all is like trying to unravel the mysteries of the universe. I'm a huge fan of John Carpenter's original, and I've managed to go my entire life without seeing another Halloween movie. That is until 2022, when I decided to watch David Gordon Green's entire trilogy. I didn't enjoy any of them, and while this might not be the worst, a distinction I'd have to give to Halloween Kills, it's still not a good film or a worthwhile viewing experience. There's a lot of cinematic cliches I hate, but when it comes to horror films, the one that probably annoys me the most is plots and storylines being propelled through character stupidity, and that's the only reason this film exists. On top of being virtually indestructible, Michael Myers is also telepathic now, and passes his urge to kill onto a brand new character, making this a slasher film where the most interesting element, the killer, is barely in it at all. It has a few decent moments here and there, but it's so obsessed with reminding you of the films that came before it that, outside of box office revenue, there's no good reason for it to even exist in the first place. At number 2, Scream 5. I might get some hate for this one, but Scream 5 did absolutely nothing for me. Aside from, like many other horror follow-ups, reminding me that the first film was great, sequels are bad, jump scares are stupid, and meta-commentary is a very difficult thing to do well. While the original film was able to poke fun at horror movie tropes and analyse their story structures in a fun and interesting way, Scream 5, which was billed as having the same name as the first movie for maximum confusion and annoyance, is so grating with its wink-wink, nudge-nudge self-awareness that it's just a pain to sit through. I'm very much in favour of making fun of cliches, but if your film is going to use those cliches unironically, then what exactly was the point you were trying to make? It's sad that Scream has succumbed to the sequel problem that's tainted many a horror series, but there was another film I seen this year, another horror sequel, a follow-up to one of my favourite films of all time, which was far, far worse. At number 1, 2022's Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Believe it or not, Texas Chainsaw Massacre was the first film I seen in 2022, and despite 12 entire months passing, nothing was able to top it. Anyone who knows me or has listened to the In Film We Trust podcast knows how much I love the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974. It's one of the best pure horror films of all time, and ever since its release, studios have seemingly been on a quest to stomp the franchise to death and resurrect it as yet another generic slasher series. Whether it was positioned as a reboot or a continuation of the original film, it would fail either way. It takes one of the most terrifying killers in movie history and changes every aspect of his personality that made him intimidating. On top of that, the filmmakers bring back Sally Hardesty, the sole survivor from the first movie, only to have her act as dumb as the rest of the characters and do nothing unique or interesting. The whole film, including ending credits, is 83 minutes long, which makes me think that even the filmmakers consider it a waste of time. Full of characters you don't care about, over-the-top gore that's not scary in the slightest, toothless and out-of-place social commentary, and an ending that teases the possibility of a sequel even worse than this one. It's the worst film I've seen in 2022 by a country mile, and I'm looking forward to putting it behind me and never looking back. Now that those are out of the way, let's move on to the best of list, and we begin at number 10 with Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio. No, you're not mistaken, a Pinocchio film has ended up on my best and worst of list in the exact same year. Believe it or not, there were 3 Pinocchio films released in 2022. One was the live-action remake, which I've already discussed. Another was made in Russia bearing the bizarre subtitle, A True Story, and in the English dub has, of all people, Pauly Shore voicing the lead character. The trilogy is rounded out by the only good one, courtesy of Guillermo del Toro, bringing his long-gestating passion project to life. It's not a direct adaptation of the Carlo Collodi book, but it definitely leans into its darker elements. It's a morality tale, as the story was always meant to be, focusing on a boy who isn't inherently bad, but simply has so much to learn about family, life, and just how fragile and precious our morality is. The animation is gorgeous, proving that CGI will never be a replacement for practical effects. The visuals perfectly complement the tone, and when it's over, it genuinely feels like you've been on an adventure with somebody who's learned what it truly is to be human. It's the only Pinocchio film worth watching from 2022, and I highly recommend that you do so. Next up at number 9 is Fresh. This was a movie Rachel suggested we watched back in June, and she can't even remember what made her want to watch it, and honestly, that's the perfect way to approach this film. Don't read anything about it, go in completely blind. It's similar to The Cabin in the Woods, where the first act lulls you into believing you're watching a certain kind of story, and that's when the director pulls the rug out from under you. Sebastian Stan and Daisy Edgar-Jones are both fantastic in their respective roles, and the film keeps ratcheting up the tension as you dive deeper and deeper into the central plot and its implications. I don't want to say any more because, as I mentioned earlier, you really are better off going into this film without any background whatsoever. Needless to say, you'll be very pleasantly surprised at just how damn good this film is. At number 8, Marcel the Shell with Shoes On. Unlike when I watched Fresh, I knew a fair bit about Marcel the Shell with Shoes On before I checked it out, but that did absolutely nothing to blunt its impact. I'm always attracted to a plot with a bizarre and unique concept, and that's exactly what this movie has. Filmed like a whole movie where a documentary filmmaker interviews an anthropomorphic shell who lives with his sick grandmother and a pet ball of dryer lint. Yes, really. It's a truly heartwarming story about the importance of family and looking after the ones you love. Full of warmth and humour, but also containing some real emotional gut punches, this is probably the most moving film of the year, and if you ever do watch it, I challenge you not to shed a tear. At number 7, it's Top Gun Maverick. As far as the original Top Gun movie goes, Rach and I were pretty late to the party. Truth be told, we only decided to watch it because we'd heard so many good things about Maverick and decided to watch them both to see what the fuss was all about. The 80s original is a fun film, packed with quotable lines and shameless 80s cheese, and it's not hard to see why it's still so popular. Top Gun Maverick is like a blueprint for how to make a great sequel. It's obvious the filmmakers and the cast have a deep love and appreciation for the original and want to honour it while also telling another story with a mix of new and returning characters. The role of Maverick clearly means a lot to Tom Cruise, and he gives one of the best performances of the year because of that. In the first film, he was a cocky rogue who flew in the face of rules and protocol. 36 years later, he's a relic of a bygone era, lamenting the mistakes he's made in the past and the friends he's lost. The action sequences are thrilling, the conflict between the characters well handled and realistic, and when someone seems to be in mortal danger, you really feel for them. It's incredibly rare that a sequel surpasses the original film, especially with so much time between them, but Top Gun Maverick pulls it off beautifully. At number 6, the unbearable weight of massive talent. Honestly, I can completely understand why somebody wouldn't like this film. I've watched a lot of best movies of 2022 lists, and this one showed up on none of them. Nicolas Cage has been a polarizing figure for much of his career, and his particular style of acting can leave a sour taste in people's mouths. But as a die-hard fan of his dramatic roles, as well as his, shall we say, more unorthodox performances, this film was always going to be in my top 10. It's Nick Cage playing Nick Cage. There's no way I wasn't going to love it. The cast look like they're having a blast, and I don't blame them. Pedro Pascal, another performer I'm always happy to see, plays the ultimate Nick Cage fanboy and might even come close to matching his hero for screen presence. If you removed the Cage element, it would actually work really well as a standalone spy thriller, but when you include the madman at his most energized and committed, you get by far the funniest film I've seen all year and one of the best flicks 2022 had to offer. At number 5, Everything Everywhere All at Once. In sharp contrast to the unbearable weight of massive talent, Everything Everywhere All at Once popped up on almost every best of the year list I watched, and for good reason. Easily one of the most visually striking and conceptually original films of the entire 21st century, let alone 2022. Multiverses are far from an original idea, but there's so much creativity, so much energy, and so many facets to explore that I can see think pieces being written on it for years to come. At 2 hours and 20 minutes, and with so much constantly going on, the story can feel confusing and downright exhausting at times, but it's anchored by smart writing and an outstanding performance from Michelle Yeoh, who's going to be a major contender during the awards season. While the film can be overwhelming at times, it's got a ton of heart, and the family dynamic that's at the centre of it provides some of the most emotionally affecting scenes of the year. It's one of the few films from last year that I'd say you need to see, and is further proof that A24 is by far the most important and most interesting movie studio working today. Number 4, The Banshees of Inisherin. Martin McDonagh made the jump from the stage to the big screen in 2008 and has wasted no time in establishing himself as one of the most talented writer-directors working today. The Banshees of Inisherin sees him reunited with Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson, who were fantastic together in Bruges, and gives them some of his best material yet. Farrell's attracted a lot of plaudits for his performance, with many calling it the best of his career, but we shouldn't sleep on Gleeson, who works as a perfect counterpoint to our lead's cheery optimism. Packed full of the kind of witty dialogue and black comedy McDonagh's films are known for, as well as his trademark tonal shifts and sudden injections of pathos, it's a film that's both eye-wateringly funny and deeply emotionally affecting. Add to that Barry Keoghan's criminally overlooked performance as one of the year's most tragic cinematic figures, and you get my 4th favourite film of the year. At number 2 and number 3, I'm not sure exactly in which order to place them, we've got Pearl and X. Since these films were both written and directed by the same person, and were made back to back, and are both among not just the best movies of 2022, but are among my favourite horror films of all time, it made sense to put them together. X and Pearl share obvious similarities and complement each other when watched one after the other, but you can watch either as a standalone and still enjoy them. As a prequel, Pearl isn't just about setting up all the plot points of the film that would follow it, it's a window into a time in history and a glance into the life of a deeply troubled individual who seems confined to a dark and unpromising future. X picks up the story decades later, bringing the Pearl character back but building an entirely new story around her. I love its period details, its tributes to both the time it takes place in and the films of the day, as well as its creative kills and building of suspense. Mia Goth's monologue during Pearl's third act might just be the single greatest piece of acting I've seen in the entire calendar year. Do yourself a favour, check out both films, preferably in one sitting, and see why they're such a big deal and such a blast to watch. And finally, coming in at number 1, it's The Batman. Honestly, it was really difficult to decide what I wanted at the top of the list. Frankly, if you were to ask me in a few weeks' time, I might say X, or maybe even Pearl, but The Batman was just such an utter joy to watch. A visual treat, a compelling story, beautiful neo-noir elements, and some of the best staged and most exciting action sequences of the year. What I loved so much about it, and from what I've read this is a very common opinion, is the fact that it's actually about the Batman. Robert Pattinson spends about 85% of the film as the Caped Crusader, and at its heart it's a detective story set in a sleazy city where crime and corruption are rampant. Matt Reeves' Gotham feels like it's straight out of a novel from the likes of Raymond Chandler or James Cain. Rather than trying to make a superhero film that tops the one that came before it, this one goes in a different direction, and it's all the better for it. Paul Dano's Riddler feels a bit close to Heath Ledger's Joker to truly be its own thing, but Dano acts the hell out of his part and does create an unsettling villain. Also, I feel like it could have been cut down by about 15 minutes, with the climax going on way longer than necessary. Little issues aside though, this was, at the time of writing at least, my favourite film of 2022. Is it the best Batman film ever made? I don't know, I haven't seen them all and I'm not in a hurry to do so, honestly. I'm just glad it did its own thing and wasn't concerned with being more spectacular or more grandiose than the installments that came before it, and when the sequel drops, I will be all over it. So those were my best and worst movies of 2022. Did you agree, disagree? Let me know in the comments below and tell me what were your favourite and least favourite movies of last year. If you like movie podcasts, check out the description. I'll put a link to the In Film We Trust podcast's Twitter, Instagram and our Anchor page. If you follow the Anchor link, you can also find links to our podcast on Google Podcasts and on Spotify. Once again, thank you very much for checking out my lists, and hopefully I'll see you all again next year.